Tonight on the Online Wine Tasting Club, we get some top fashion tips from Bruce Tyrrell.
Yeah, the blokes, driving the tractors at night had gone from their underpants to an Eskimo suit.
Dan definitely needs a lesson in how to identify a grapevine. And we are joined by our tame master of wine, Emma Symington. It's time to go explore some of Australia's lesser known but no less delicious grapes with the Adventurer series Alternative Australia.
Good evening. How is everybody? So it's a little bit different. I know we used to Zoom and then we YouTubed, and now we're back to doing a little bit of Zoom webinar because we need to do that to be able to have guest hosts come and join us. So we're doing Alternative Australia, and I do not think there could be a better person to join us than Emma Symington, Master of Wine, who works for Wine Australia to guide us through. So she can start picking holes in bits and pieces that me and Alex don't know and help out with any questions. So feel free to jump in the chat and ask any questions. But a wonderful welcome, and thank you very much for joining us, Emma.
Thanks for having me. Really pleased to be here.
Fantastic. So, we're going to do Alternative Australia, but, Australia is just, it's a mental country. There's so much great stuff, so much great wine. But why for you is it important to get these emerging and different, and it's not always unique varietals. I think there's going to be a lot of people in the tastings day who'll say, oh yeah, I know Grenache, I know Semillon, but what is it that that is important for Australia to get a bigger reach for these varietals and wine growing regions?
I just think there's so much excitement in Australia at the minute with some of these lesser known varieties. I mean, obviously, Shiraz is 25% of everything grown in Australia. It really is its calling card. And then you've got Chardonnay and Cabernet. And that's kind of what everyone knows Australia for. But the reality is there's over 130 different grape varieties grown in Australia, which sounds like loads. But when you remember how big Australia is, compared, it's bigger than Europe, you sort of realise why so many different grape varieties have a happy home there. And some of these wines we've got today, I just think are absolutely so exciting. And I'm really happy to share them with you all.
Fantastic. So as always with our wine tasting, the most important thing is to have a bit of juice in the glass, so everyone can go ahead and get one in the glass. So this is from Jim Barry, and this is an Assyrtiko, which is a grape that you generally find in Greece and in Santorini, which
it's become the sort of this absolute statement grape of Greece now. And Greece is another place that has a huge history in winemaking, of course, and it's got lots and lots of different grape varieties. Each island has got its own little style and its own grape, but this one is particularly associated with Santorini because the Gaia vineyards are
absolutely. So the Barry family went on holiday 2006 and fell in love with the wine, with the island, with the style, and took the cuttings from Gaia Vineyard in Santorini and brought them back. And they're in the Clare Valley. They started, so they started this project in 2006. Quarantine to get any grapes and bits and pieces into Australia is a tough job. It takes a lot of time to get it over, and it quarantines and propagates, and they ended up with not very many vines when they finally got them through quarantining in. It's just a 2 or 3, and I think it was 2012 was the first when they actually got them planted at their Lodge Hill site, and I think it was 2015 was the first vintage that we saw come over to the UK from this. And I think that's amazing that it was really a 10-year project of love for this cool, quirky grape that's really exciting. So let's have a little sip on this. The Poly-V is up and running, so you can put your tasting notes in Poly-V. It's not going to pop up on the screen, but we'll have a look through and we'll give the top notes that people could do in there. But while we sit through this, we've got a lovely video with a little introduction to what we feel about Alternative Australia.
Fantastic. Enjoy. Australia. It's big and it's hot, with great beaches. It's full of dangerous animals, and it makes Shiraz and Chardonnay. That is perhaps the standard cliched and utterly oversimplistic view of this quite wonderful country. Now, if you've been on one of our other tastings, you'll have seen us show the whole of Europe overlaid over this country, and if you haven't, it's worth looking again because It is mind-boggling. All of Europe's major wine regions are covered by this single country. Naturally, that leads to a huge diversity of environments to grow grapes in. But the challenge is that most of this range starts hot and goes hotter. A significant part of the country is a desert, and in fact, over 70% of it receives less than 500 millimeters of rain every year, making it semi-arid at best. That is a big challenge. Winemaking is therefore restricted to the southern, cooler side of the country, right next to the coast. Australia's heat was at the heart of how it made such ripe, fruity wines for which it's famous. But as it has sought to go upmarket, the styles of wine being made there have got cooler and fresher and a little more old world in style. The trouble is that while the trend was for less jammy, cooler wines, the environment had other plans. Many people describe wine as the canary in the mine when it comes to climate change, with grapes so sensitive to even tiny changes in temperature over growing season. And sorry Donald, but this is no theory. The changes that have already been seen are dramatic. We spoke to one winemaker who's been growing in the same spot for 40 years. The grapes now ripen so fast that they are picked 6 whole weeks before they did in the 1990s. That is an astonishing difference. Of course, with the increasing temperatures and droughts, so too do bushfires. Many vintners have seen their livelihoods destroyed overnight, and the most recent year's ones are particularly vicious. So, if the coolest places are the only places where you can really grow wine, what on earth can the industry do? Well, it's a very difficult question, but a big part is in reconsidering what grapes to use and where to plant them. Rather than the warmer northern slopes of the hills, the shadier southern slopes are increasingly in demand. And there's lots of things you can do in the vineyard too. I'll go into those a little bit later. But the big question is over the varieties of grapes that you use. Bordeaux has been seeing the same issues of climate change and has just recently allowed in grapes from hot countries like Touriga Nacional from Portugal that cope with the heat better. Of course, Australia does today grow a lot more than just Shiraz and Chardonnay, and many of these grapes have a long history in the country. In fact, the first alternative grape planted here was probably Dolcetto, way back in 1868. It was in the mid-1900s the industry really got behind the French varieties, but Aussies love to experiment. Innovation has always been at the heart of the Australian wine industry. In the late 20th century, much work was being done on experimenting with other varieties like Viognier and things like Tramina and Silvaner. The Australian scientific research body has also created brand new grapes that have been especially designed for the challenge of climate change. These have names like Sienna, Taranga and Mystique, which are probably going to take a while to become household names. Anyway, tonight we're going to try out some of the incredible range of grapes that you might not expect to find in Australia, to see what a vast range of styles this country has to offer, and also some of the tools they'll be using over the coming years as the climate continues to warm. We start in the Clare Valley near Adelaide with Jim Barry, who got a little bit carried away on holiday in Greece and didn't just come back with some trinkets, but some Assyrtiko cuttings from Santorini, the island where vines have to survive blistering sun but somehow retain astonishing acidity. We then head east to the Hunter Valley to explore the utterly unique wines made from Semillon that seem to defy the standard laws of winemaking. Moving to the McLaren Vale, we visit Coriol, the original pioneers of Sangiovese, Fiano and Peakpool in Australia, just to see what happens when you take the grape from the heart of Chianti and transplant it into the red soils down under. Just down the road, we find Grenache fanatics Thistledown with their She's Electric single vineyard project. Grenache, or Garnacha as it's known in Spain, is definitely a grape that seems to be coping incredibly well with this extra heat. We have heard several winemakers saying that it is going to be Australia's next big thing, so watch this space. Next up for Wine 5, we go all in on hot and dry by visiting Riverina, where we find a grape that is known in Australia as Durif from Bob Burton. Finally, we go all Iberian with a fascinating blend from Stephen Pennell, who has crossed Spanish Tempranillo with Portuguese Touriga Nacional, creating something rather out there, but perfectly designed to cope with the heat. For now, let's head back to the cooler areas from wine number 1 to see how what is known as the modern face of Greek wine fares in the Clare Valley. Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that little introduction. It's just so great to see that map which shows Europe overlaid on top of it and giving you that idea of the distance.
And yeah, and I think once again we say this on so many tastings, and I'm sure Emma will agree with us. It's wonderful to have these 6 wines, but to try and pick 6 wines to showcase the alternatives of Australia is we could do a year's worth of tasting doing this, couldn't we?
We could do Fiano, Vermentino,
and maybe just from one winery. We talked to we've got our, Bob Burton later, and he does Vermentino, Fiano, Viognier, which it's not a brand new grape, but relatively new, in Australia, and it's absolutely fantastic. But looking at the tasting notes for this wine, it's everything that you would expect from this Urtica. We're lemon, we're grass, we're apple, we're pineapple, we've got sea salt, and we get that salinity when we're in Greece from it being very, very close to the ocean. Clare Valley, not on an island, but you've definitely got that water range, coming up the up the east side of it. It's a little bit more inland, but you're probably still getting that ocean effect, aren't you, as it comes through?
A little bit of ocean influence in Clare, but really the important thing in Clare is that it's got this massive diurnal variation. So it gets really hot in the daytime in Clare. It's not really a cool climate region. You're talking 35, 40 degrees in the summer and the daytime. But at night time, it's probably dropping down to 10 or even 5 degrees. So you're talking a 30 plus degree difference between daytime and nighttime temperature. And that is why you get this incredible acidity in this wine. And it's the same with Clare Valley Riesling, keeping that beautiful zippy acidity. And that's what you get from this, quite particular climate in the Clare Valley.
And I think that's a hugely important point, that, you don't have to be warm climate or cool climate. It's about having that temperature range to allow yourself to get, this beautiful fresh fruit. There's these tropical fruits in here, people have put, orange rind and pineapple and honey and blossom and stone fruit, all those kind of things. And if it was just 35 degrees, all day, every day, it would just be flabby, and it would just be a very kind of boring wine. There wouldn't be that. But because you've got this cool evenings, that you get this beautiful zip to it. So I think it's an absolutely beautiful drop of wine.
Yeah, I couldn't agree.
I think it's quite funny because we featured Gaia Vineyards, Leto and Yanis, the 2 winemakers there, and they were describing how that you actually find the salt forming really on the outside of the grapes there, and that's what goes into the press. So there's all sorts of talk we have about how this salinity and minerality come in, but I think one of the other things I'd heard is there's this particular kind of acid, which I think salicylic acid, which can really lead to a bit of that same kind of saline
You're
flavour.
getting all techie, all techie.
Yeah. But it definitely, for me, it fits into the. I see this as having a bit of an overlap with those Clare Valley Rieslings in style, and which I think are some of the most delicious Rieslings in the world. I really do.
Oh, absolutely. And you talk about Clare as a region. It is about those bright, fresh, high acid, zippy wines, and this is a certificate from Jim Barry, but really, if you want people who stake their claim on a Riesling, and Jim Barry makes some of the best Rieslings on the planet, in my opinion. So really cool stuff. Other great Rieslings are available. I'm not going to get too fanboy about it. There are some amazing Rieslings to get out there and try. But yeah, so
you'd have thought it, a sommelier loving his Rieslings.
Riesling and a certificate, quite.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's it's fantastic that they've gone through this process of spending all that time bringing it into the country, going through quarantine, making sure it's all safe. But the other thing which really sort of I can't help but think is such a big difference between Santorini and here is that when we were talking to them, they were describing how they grow them in these baskets, or kuros as they're known, which is designed to really protect it from the wind and keep it all low to the ground. But you probably don't need to do that in Clare. But the roots of those baskets, some of them on the vineyard of Gaia, go hundreds of years old, literally hundreds of years old. They were sort of estimating some of them to be 600 years old, which is kind of crazy. So here you've got something which isn't perhaps pulling so much out of the soil, but it's still producing a remarkably similar style of wine. And
it's a very, very good wine. This is alternative Australia with Alex's Greek history lesson at the same time. So let's do a little bit less Greece and a little bit more Australia. But we should probably get into the next wines. And
I think we should.
Speaking of old grapes and old vines, this is Tyrrell's, and we're in the Hunter Valley now, and famous for Semillon. And Bruce, who we've got a little interview with, which we'll jump onto momentarily, he's got parcels of Semillon that's over 100 years old. He's got 9 different parcels, and he said to me there's about 3 parcels left, and he's hoping to get hold of them all by himself, so he could be the man with the old Semillon. But so Hunter Valley, when I went to Australia, Hunter Valley kind of struck me as a place that it makes wine like no other place. You can go to Margaret River and you can drink Margaret River Chardonnay and say, well, it's got a hint of a Californian style, it's got a bit of Burgundy about it. You can drink some of the cooler climate Shiraz, and you can say, oh, that could remind me a little bit of the Rhone Valley, if you like that kind of thing. But Hunter Valley Semillon, for me, is like no other wine in the world. You can't compare it to anything else. And when it's young and fresh and bright like this, it's a phenomenal seafood wine. And then as it ages, it turns into this whole different world. So Emma, tell us a bit about Hunter and what is really, really cool about it. And then we'll talk to Bruce and what you love about it.
So for me, Hunter, a bit like Clare, is one of those regions where it's got its very, very specific climate. But I think Hunter's fascinating because it's a region that, if you looked at its vital stats on paper, it's really not where you'd be choosing to plant grapes, and certainly not where you think you'd be getting premium wine, because it's hot, 40 degrees in the summer, if not more. It's humid, which is really not what you want for viticulture. And at vintage time, they tend to get big rains, big showers of rain that comes through, which is really not what you want, when you're trying to pick your grapes to make your wine. But it's fascinating because it's this crazy climate that is why you get this such unique style of Semillon. Because yes, it's hot, but actually they have a lot of cloud cover, which actually delays the ripening. So the grapes don't get as ripe as you would think they might at this temperature. And then because of these rains that come through at the end of it, at vintage time, they actually had to pick quite early to escape those rains, which is why you end up with a wine like this, which is 10% alcohol. So really quite low in alcohol, but high in acidity. And that is why these wines can age for decades, because they have this incredible acidity. I just think they're quite phenomenal in the world of wine.
They are, and you taste an old Semillon, and you could turn around. You could win a lot of blind tasting competitions by asking people whether it's got oak or not in it, because it gets this nutty. There must be, and how it's never seen a touch of oak ever, and it's absolutely amazing. But rather than me whittle on about it, should we pop and see Bruce Tyrrell and see what he's got to say?
Let's.
Semillon's grown a lot of places around the world. First came to Australia in the very early parts of settlement. 2 sources, obviously out of Bordeaux, but probably more importantly earlier, out of South Africa. There's all the boats coming here, stopped in Cape Town to, resupply and then go on for the big hike across the Indian Ocean. So it came then, a lot of people, and we assume it was Semillon, called it green grape. And that was because when you picked it, it had this wonderful fresh green colour and vibrancy, I suppose. Been tried everywhere pretty much, but here is where it's settled. Obviously, it's a bit like Bordeaux. It's a bit like around Cape Town, we're 20 miles as the crow flies from the sea. We get pretty hot days, we get humidity, but we get a cool southerly breeze, southeasterly breeze pretty much every night during summer. I've seen a diurnal difference back in 2001. We were 47.5 degrees centigrade at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And by 2 o'clock the next morning, it was 7.5 degrees. So it's massive.
That's
change.
huge.
Yeah. The blokes, driving the tractors at night had gone from their underpants to an Eskimo suit from when they started doing. So we do get, what are the things that are different to the Hunter that makes it work? There are those things. We're close to the coast. We've got humidity. We've got a quite large diurnal range temperature. And we've got a lot of, we're geographically very, very old here in Hunter. Hunter Valley used to be a vast undersea canyon, went all the way back to Moree, which from the coast would be 800 kilometres, and then rose up during the volcanic times into the valley as it is today. But it rose up quite slowly, so it spent a long time as a shallow tropical sea. So we don't really have any, we've got a lot of underground water, for instance, but most of it's quite salty because of that. So we really can't use that. So a lot of this is grapes are still dry grown, which I'm sure has got an impact. But Semillon, to me, growing-wise, seems to like to mature in the heat. Everyone talks you can only grow grapes in cool climates, and they can go and sit in the corner and drink Coca-Cola, because that's not really the way it works. So Semillon seems to like the heat early, and what happens is we're picking it at basically 10.5 to 11.5 alcohol. And the reason we do that is that's when it's flavour ripe. So you get these wonderful flavours, but lower alcohol, and there's terrific acid, 3.13 pHs. Acid probably doesn't matter that much to us. We pick on flavour and pH more than anything. I'm lucky enough to own 9 blocks over 100 years old on their original roots. No grafting, no nothing. These are
that's kind of unheard of, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. These are amongst the rarest plants in the world. And I'm about to get another couple. There's only 3 left that I don't own, and I'll try very hard till I've own all of them. So Semillon is really a wine of 2-3 lives. Yeah, and I think this just shows you what you're tasting in that wine. Only is what came out of the vineyard. There's no extras, no addeds, no winemakers mucking around. Yeah, it's interesting, those varieties, we're just starting to handle some Fiano. And we're finding we want to pick it just before 12 alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sensational. There's beautiful acid and that wonderful sort of fresh pear character. But similar to this, you just sit and drink it. I think if someone asked me what I'd focused my life on, everyone's got a life's work. It's this variety. This is just, and probably if I wasn't allowed to ever drink red again, I could live with that. As long as I could drink these, but drink them at about 10 years old. And they do that. It's a sort of young, fresh style. They get to about 5 years old and they sort of jump through a hoop and they fill out. They start to fill out and show some bottle age, but still that really racy clean acid. And then at about 10 years old, they do it again. And that's when you see them almost become white Burgundy.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing that, and this is what I think is amazing about this grape and this style from the Hunter, is you start with what's in the glass here. It's bright, it's fresh, it's drinkable. And you drink something that's 10, 12 years old and, you tell people there's no oak on it and they think you're mad because it's got this richness, it's got this roundness, it's got this nuttiness, it's got this texture about it. It's like, how does that happen without it having any mallow, any oak, and all those things that you expect to get that flavour and texture? It's insane, but it's epic, and that's why I love this grape from this region because it does do something for everyone through its life cycle.
That was a fascinating little chat with Bruce there, who is probably the name in Semillon from the Hunter Valley, isn't he?
Tyrrell's is great, and there are some wonderful. I really like Tyrrell's. Broken Wood is fantastic. There's some great producers there, but Tyrrell's, they have this, and then they have their VAT one as well. And they're one of the most awarded wineries in the Hunter Valley, if not in all of Australia, for the wines that they make. And he's all about having what's in the vineyard, very simple winemaking, not adding too much. And I sat with him for about an hour for that interview and trying to cut it down to the thing. He told a little story about if you get a new winemaker come in and he wants to do something different with the Semillon, what you got to do is you got to take him around the back of the vineyard and shoot him. And it's like, he goes, that might sound a little bit harsh, but if you just fire him, he's going to go and mess with somebody else's Semillon. So don't let him do it. So but he's proper old school, and he turns around and says, if you had to, people have a life work for something, and he's like, my life work has been Hunter Valley Semillon, and he was an absolute delight to talk to, and he's like, the stuff is in the vineyard. It's great stuff. It's great history, and they started off, in the Hunter, there was a lot of, wines being made to be fortified and things like that. And it's nice to see, and once again, with a massive blanket statement of Australia, we're seeing, a lot of the wines that come over are 15, 16%, really big, high alcohol. And it's really good to have something a little bit different that sits 10, 11%. It's nice, it's fresh, and it's good drinking. It's not sad and watery and light because there's no power behind it for the alcohol. It just does a really, really good job.
I think, for me, one of the fascinating things about the Hunter Valley is that when you think of Semillon and then you think of moisture in the vineyards and heat, then that sort of starts leading me down the line of, well, one of the other great classic wines that Australia makes, the sticky, the sweet dessert wines. And if you think about the great wines of Bordeaux, Sauternes and, Cadillac and things like that is all about taking this particular grape and allowing the moisture to create mould on it that makes it go horrible and grotty. And they look disgusting. You wouldn't eat a mouldy loaf of bread, but somehow we make this beautiful dessert wine out of botrytis grapes like that. But that's not really what Hunter Valley's for. But there's plenty of them in Australia. I think it's more from Riverina?
Rutherglen and places like that. You're getting those stickies from. Some really cool stuff. So, any final thoughts on Hunter? Anything we haven't covered? Well, there's loads we haven't covered, but any exactly. We should just do an evening on Hunter Valley next time.
We do have one good question, which is about old vines sound cool, but what actual difference does it make to the wine?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And again, this is something we can spend hours just talking about that. But I think the key here, and what many winemakers would say, is old vines don't necessarily make good wines, but good wines make old vines. By which I mean, if you're making good wine from a vineyard, you're going to keep those vines in the ground. So that's why they become old, because they were already making good wines. But certainly there's some science behind the fact that obviously the older the vines are, the deeper the roots go, so the more nutrients they can take up. So they're much more adaptable to small changes in climate and that kind of thing. So yes, they definitely do make a difference.
You often hear sort of people talking about how you get less fruit on the vines as well. The yields tend to be a bit lower,
and people talk intensity and depth of flavour and concentration, and words like that pop through as well.
Yeah, but I mean, who knows? It's like you say, you could talk a lot about this for a very long time, and it certainly is. I think that's a really fascinating way to view it. They would be ripped up if they were not making something good.
Exactly that.
Oh. Without a doubt, yeah. I don't think anyone sets out planting their vineyard to go, that'll be ready in 100 years. I'm setting out to do old vines. Don't care what the wine is for the next 100 years. I just want to have some really old vines.
But you've got your dead arm Shiraz from Darrenberg in McLaren Vale, and the whole point of that is that their vines are pruned into a cordon system, a double cordon system, where one arm goes out one way, another arm goes out that way, and one of the arms for various reasons, probably some kind of a disease has got in, that trunk has died. And so it's put all of its effort into half the amount of fruit. I'm just trying to see if I can get in your face.
You should be nicer. The wine's on my side, mate.
Oh, yeah, good point. I'll shut up. But yeah, it's certainly the concentration can massively help it. But it's a very cool wine and a good food wine now.
Absolutely. So it's probably time for a little splash of red, isn't it? And we'll head to McLaren Vale, and we'll go to. I've got to find the right bottle here.
Fortuitous, isn't it?
Huh? I know. It's very good, isn't it? There we are, one of these. And Coriol, so we're at McLaren Vale, we're doing a Sangiovese. So we're seeing more and more Italian varietals. These guys, it's the Lloyd family, and they founded around 1967, was the year that they started their winery up. And Australia's got this what I class as like a double history. There's some, really old ground, a really old winemaking, 1800, even pre that, lots of old winemaking. And then there was, the big fortified style. And then you got to the late 60s and 70s, and that's when we got into what we class as, the modern day cool winemaking. So at that point, there would have been a lot of, Shiraz and Chardonnay and stuff like that around. And these guys were pioneering, these Italian varietals. They do Picpol, they do Montepulciano, they do Fiano, and I just love this. This is their Sangiovese, so I'm going to pop a little bit in the glass. And Emma, do you want to chuck a little bit in about what people are doing with Italian varietals and bits and pieces like that, and why they work, and what's changing in Australia that are making people get behind these kind of things?
Absolutely. So I think, the Italian varieties and theme is really exciting in Australia at the minute. And again, it's not necessarily all new. I think a lot's changed after World War II. There was a big influx actually out of Italy, particularly across to Australia. And so, these Italians moved out to Australia. And one thing they wanted to have was table wine to drink, at home with dinner. What they knew was Italian grape varieties. So at that time, people started thinking about planting Italian grape varieties. And then certainly more towards the end of the 20th century, more and more people started experimenting with these. But I think more recently, people have realised that perhaps actually a lot of these grape varieties are more suited to the climate in Australia than in certain regions than perhaps some of the more traditional grape varieties that were planted in Australia. Just the fact that a lot of these Italian grape varieties come from quite hot places in Italy, and can cope with the heat and can cope with less water and so on, and seem to be well suited to different parts of Australia.
Is there anybody doing? So are other people doing more of the sort of the southern, the Pulian sort of grape varieties like Primitivo and things like that you tend to see really cope well with that sort of heat? Yeah,
certainly. There's certainly some Primitivo grown. I had one the other day actually from Kangarilla Road in McLaren Vale. There's also quite a lot of Nera d'Avola. All sorts of different bits and bobs. And the white varieties as well.
And I think that's an important thing, and we're starting to see it, and we talk about old world versus new world. Old world for me, that's kind of it's fading into kind of, as things are getting a little bit warmer, everything's becoming a bit more new worldy anyway. But I think places like Australia, California, and the traditional new world countries have that kind of leg up because they're not tied to growing certain grape varietals. They don't have to be 68% Sangiovese or 93% Cabernet Sauvignon or whatever some weird AOC or DOCG rule is. So I think it becomes a double-edged sword that people go, what, Sangiovese from Australia, that doesn't make sense, that's an Italian grape. But it's also, I think it gives winemakers and viticulturists a chance to trial things and also be a little bit ahead of the game. And I think that's why, we'll talk a little bit more about what climate change is doing with grapes and what we can do to help that a little bit further down. But do you think that gives Australia absolute pioneers in these new grape varieties? You take Yalumba and Oxford Landing, they've got more seeds and grape cuttings than anywhere else on the planet. Do you think that's we know it's good for Australia, but does it make it more confusing for people to pick out an Australian wine and work out what they're going to enjoy and what they're going to like?
Possibly, I think so. It's tricky because in terms of what Australia exports, it is the key grape varieties. A lot of this kind of stuff is made in Australia and drunk in Australia. I think the Aussies domestically love experimenting and trying some of these new grape varieties that are grown in Australia. Actually, we don't see a huge amount of what they produce in these kind of varieties over here, sadly. But I think if you're
I was blown away when I
wine,
visited. I just couldn't. When I visited there, I couldn't believe it. I hadn't heard of half of the names. I hadn't, didn't know they grew those kind of grapes there, and it was an absolute revelation just touring around. I think your experience was remarkably similar.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're interested in wine over here and you sort of have some understanding of how big Australia is, and therefore it kind of makes sense that they can experiment with all these different grape varieties. And I think, as you said, Jamie, the Aussies are big experimenters. They like trying new things, and they have the ability to do that. I think they just love trying a new grape variety, seeing how it grows, seeing what they can do with the winemaking, and what comes out at the end of it.
I had a very profound piano tuner. That's where we're going now with this conversation.
Okay.
And
I'll sit back and let it run.
Let it roll. No, seriously, because he was extolling me on the virtues of Australian-built pianos, and you captured that exact essence. So the people who make Steinways in Germany and in New York, for people who aren't piano aficionados, that's the big boy. That's the one you want to have. 100 grand for a piano, but it will gain in value over time, whereas the others drop in value. They know how to make a Steinway because that's how they've always made a Steinway. And you get the sort of feeling with a lot of, perhaps up until very recent years, a lot of old world countries were guided by tradition and how we've always made it, and they'd lost some of the piano makers had lost the knowledge of what made it good or bad. So Australia, starting from nothing, were now going, okay, well, I'll try it. I'll tweak that a bit. I'll do this, and it's and find out what it is. And so they had a better understanding of what was at the heart of making something work or not. And that is, I think, what I start to see in this winemaking process as well. Let's do a small batch of this, and it might not come off, or it might be incredible, and they take the risks. So it is a national trait, and I love it. I think it's a really admirable trait.
I couldn't agree more. It was a very elegant way of putting it as well.
Thank you.
Wow, Alex got
tuner.
called eloquent. We'll make a note of that.
I think one of the big differences when you, God, I actually would have this on my wall forevermore. A master of wine called me eloquent. That's not going to happen again tonight, I'm sure. But one of the big differences between this and if you're taking a classic Chianti is the tannins, and the tannins don't have that kind of quite so much that angular sort of pointy dig into your tongue.
It's much more velvety. There's better integration of it and things like that. It is, and this is where I'm going to jump in and do my Australia fanboy, love it, best place in the world to get grapes ever. Is a lot of the old world
She's
stuff.
Not paying him, He's actually genuine.
a lot of old world wines, and it comes back to a bit of tradition, are designed to be grippy, tannic, tight, lay it down for 15 years before you can drink it. People aren't doing that anymore. People, the people who are collecting wine and laying wine down is few and far between if we take it as a percentage of wine consumers. Yeah. It's nothing.
And the wines then get so expensive you
don't want to drink them anyway. These wines are delicious. You open them up, you explore, you do this, and there's balance. This is 14.5% alcohol, so it's not little by any stretch of the imagination, but it's so well balanced. It's smooth, it's round, it's delightful.
What do the tasting notes say?
I remember where, when I was over there, it was about people experimenting and people trying. And if you went into a winery and tasted one of their wines and you said, "Hey, I don't really like that," they go, "Why? What is it that you don't like?" Well, it was too this, too that, not enough this, and they just go, "Well, that's the kind of wine I make." But if you go 2 vineyards down and go and see Dave, he's got just the kind of wine that you'd like. And so much of Australia is about lifting each other up rather than, you go to some other countries, and I'm not going to I'll be banned if I make but they'll turn around and go, "Well, my wine is the best, and if you don't like my wine, you must know nothing about wine." We went to Lewin in Margaret River, and they were bringing wines up for this lunch we were having, and you know, the winemaker turned around to us and said, "You guys have been in Australia for a week. If you're bored of Australian wine, you know, I've got some Spanish stuff, some French stuff if you want to drink that." Because the important thing was that we had a good time, you know, that we enjoyed our experience and great wine to go with it. And I think that's huge. You know, wine, what's in the bottle has to be good, but it's the culture, the experience and the people that really, really make it what it is and the stories that go with it. You know,
We're being very profound tonight, aren't we?
yes, something like that. Well,
There's not been any badgers, which is fantastic.
oh, you've started it now.
But
yeah,
great
tasting notes. We've got cherry, we've got red fruit, we've got vanilla, we've got berries, we've got
Soft
roasted,
tangs.
we've got caramel. Which it's Chianti plus tasting notes, so it's Chianti with a bit more power. So if you like Chianti but want to be a little bit more drinkable,
Chocolate, yeah.
chocolate, absolutely. So
Umami as well. I like
phenomenal,
that.
phenomenal
It
tasting
does,
notes
it's
there.
Definitely
So-
got that sort of indescribable thing that umami is. You know.
Exactly. Oh, there's a koala in the tasting notes.
Oh, thank you.
Koala emoji. Well done. Whoever got that in does not win a prize.
Are you sure it's not a drop bear?
Definitely
Anyway,
not a drop bear.
No, we're not going down that one.
You've
We've
gone
done
from
that.
profound and gone the other way now.
We're talking about the winemaking community, whether they're pointing guns to each other's head or whether they are collaborating and trying to make things better. And I think what I love about the English wine scene at the moment is how experimental it is. We don't have that big history of tradition of, we know it's always got to be Pinot Noir, it has to be in French oak, it has to be 40% whole bunch, or whatever it's got to be. There's not that thing. There's hundreds of sort of little winemakers around the country who are doing cool experimental things. And I'm now starting to wonder how much that is down to the fact that almost all of them were taught by an Aussie, Tony Milnowski. And I'm now like sat there thinking, because I'm going to say it's down to Tony perhaps, but also down to the youth of the industry. And there are a lot of people in the English wine industry who are trying to sort of follow the old world route and go, we need to define, this is it, we're going to put a name on it, and it can't be called English wine unless it's this. And I think that's a massive mistake to make in this industry's infancy.
Fantastic.
Go on, I've got to go off my pedestal now.
No, that's all good. That's all good. So we've done a bit of Coriol. Tasting notes great. Absolutely love Sangiovese. But it's now probably time to move on to the She's Electric. No need to sing a song yet. We're not at that point yet. But we're going to do the She's Electric Grenache. So we're still in McLaren Vale. We've not gone too far. But this is Old Vine Single Vineyard Grenache, and we'll jump onto an interview momentarily.
What does old vine mean in Australian terms? Is there a legal definition, or?
Not in McLaren Vale, but in Barossa there absolutely is. Barossa is
Really?
pretty much the only region in the world that actually has it legally defined. In Europe, old vine can mean anything, literally anything. 2 years old, old vine.
Yeah, I planted this one yesterday and this one today, so that one is Old
Older,
Vine.
definitely. But yeah, no, in Barossa, an old vine has to be 35 years or more old. You then have a survivor vine, which is 70 years or more old. Centenarian vine, clues in the name, 100 years or more old. And then you have an ancestor vine, which is 125 years or more old, which is just quite amazing. So yeah, it is defined in Barossa, and I think they're working on it in McLaren Vale.
Fantastic. I think that's really good because, yeah, I mean, people should be sort of celebrating these things a bit. Sarah Abbott's got her Old Vine project, which we're big supporters of, and I think that in this sort of throwaway culture that we have today, people are just too quick to sort of rip things up and not to explore what they can do. So anyway, let's talk. Well, this is James going to move this one on to Wine 4 so that we can get our tasting notes in for that. But She's Electric.
So
now,
this is probably, from what we're pouring today, probably the grape that people were most likely to have some association with. You know, we see Grenache in our Rhone blends. We see Garnacha in Spain a lot.
lots of GSM blends. Coming out of
Absolutely,
Australia.
we see GSM blends, but Grenache is a single varietal. Sometimes a bit few and far between, and this is a really cool project. So this project, first vintage for. There's two masters of wine who do this project, Thistledown, and their first vintage was 2011. 2011, and they made a Grenache Tempranillo blend because they're kind of following some Iberian stuff, and that's what Giles had always kind of liked. He liked those kind of wines and wanted to do it. And they've got different projects with different kind of, different sites within McLaren Vale, some old vines, some a little bit younger, but they've really turned this grape varietal back around. So, in the 50s, Grenache was just about the biggest planted grape in Australia. It did very, very well because it got great ripeness, great sugar content, great fruitiness, and generally could get to high alcohol. So when the people are after this fortified style, Grenache was a great grape to go after. It then kind of fell away, and when Giles started doing this project, there was these people who had kept their vineyards for decades and decades and decades, pristine fruit, really good fruit, but nobody wanted it. People were buying their Shirazes and that kind of stuff. And so he was able to walk into pristine vineyards with phenomenal fruit and get it for not huge amounts of money. Fair price. He wasn't going in to rip anybody off. But 10 years later, Grenache is now one of the most expensive grapes to buy in the region because he's turned it round and made it into this. So
Tim Duval was saying that it was his favourite, and that's what he really thought that Australia's going to be coming up as their next big thing.
Absolutely. So, but we've got a little interview with this, and this is a Grenache. There's only 1,120 bottles made. Each bottle is done and numbered.
How many of these have gone through our machine?
And he turned around and said this was a decent vintage. Usually it's just under 1,000, so he did quite well this year with this. But this is a story of a vineyard, a bird, and a power line. Let's pop to an interview.
The part of our story really was that, so 2011, we bought Grenache and we bought some Tempranillo. That was actually in the Barossa and the Adelaide Hills. As we spent more time looking around the vineyard resources that were available to us, it became more and more apparent that what we were seeing was a lot of incredible old vineyards where we could walk straight into them and be offered this amazing fruit. And it was all Grenache. And quite often the vineyard owners were reasonably old. They were fed up, having looked after these vineyards for decades. And because they're all dry-grown bush vines, they need a lot of kind of hand work. It's not automated. So they were getting a bit tired, and particularly because nobody really wanted the fruit. Nobody was really paying any money for the fruit. And we had a look at it and we just thought we have to do something here. One, because there's an opportunity. We can actually get into these incredible old vineyards. And that wouldn't have been the case if we were walking into an old Shiraz vineyard in McLaren or Barossa, because it was pretty tightly guarded. So there was an opportunity in terms of there was availability for it. The fruit was relatively cheap at the time. And we saw that actually there was a couple of opportunities there. One was that we could do something about trying to add a bit of value. The wines that were made at the time from a lot of that fruit were not great. They were quite often late picked, over extracted, stuck in new oak barrels. The wine wasn't very good. And that's why they were getting themselves into this problem, because there was no value. They were the last picked grapes because they picked Shiraz and Cabernet and everything else first. And then Grenache came in last, and the wines that were made from it were just overly ripe. The fruit was dead. And so nobody wanted to drink it. Grenache isn't really about the new Australia. It's actually about the old Australia that was forgotten, because Grenache up until the 1950s was the most widely planted variety in Australia. But because Australia previously drank and exported a huge amount of fortified styles, Grenache was the variety of choice because it almost naturally gets up to kind of fortified levels of alcohol. But when tastes changed in the 1950s and 60s and people moved away to still whites and reds, the demand for Grenache disappeared as the demand for fortifieds slowed down. So the story, if you haven't already heard it, is that this is an old vineyard. It's dry-grown bush vines. It's in an area called Seaview within McLaren Vale. It's an elevated site. The vines are probably about 70 years old, pretty much organically farmed. It's a pretty sort of scruffy-looking vineyard, to be honest, but I can see beauty in scruffiness, particularly when it comes to vineyards. And it's not very large. There's about 20 rows in total. But what is noticeable is that there's a small patch of quite young bush vines in the middle of it, surrounded by these old ones. And there's power lines going over the vineyard. And what happened was that, it would now be about 8 or 9 years ago, was that there was a power cut. And during the power cut, there was a bird sitting on the power lines. And when the power came back on, the bird was electrocuted, fell off, and set fire to the vineyard. And before the fire service could arrive, it had destroyed this circular patch of old vines in the middle of it. And I heard the story and I just thought, I've got to do something with that. That's too good a story. The site's too beautiful. It's Grenache. We'll make some good wine from it. And at the same time, I'm showing my musical age here, the song She's Electric from Oasis came to mind, and I just thought, we'll call it She's Electric. And that's where the whole thing came from.
No, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you very much. Just one last question as we go, because we're talking about alternative Australia, and obviously we've done the Grenache here. Any other things that you think people should be looking out for that, are up and coming in Australia that they might not have seen grape-wise or region-wise that are, still hidden away a little bit that you could say, let's explore that?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads. I mean, sadly, without anybody being able to travel for the last couple of years, people haven't been going to Australia to see what's been going on. But Australia is incredibly experimental, and obviously it's also at the forefront of climate change as well, and the need to address how we grow fruit, which fruit we grow. So there's an awful lot of work being done on that, and that's driving change in terms of the varietals that are coming through. We do a lot of work up in South Australia's Riverland, which previously was kind of like the industrial winemaking centre of Australia. But it's now right at the forefront of alternative Australia. And we're doing a lot with Italian varietals up there. So we're doing wines with Montepulciano, Barbera, Nera d'Avola, Fiano, Greco, Zabibo. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming out there. McLaren Vale's got some great Fiano and Nera d'Avola as well. So there's a lot of that happening, and it's in tune with what Australia needs as well. Australia is a massive country with only 20 million people, all of whom are kind of clinging on to the coast. And yet the main wine styles that people perceive as being produced there were 15% reds, when actually what they should be drinking is a lot of crisp whites and fresher reds, which go much better with the food. So Grenache and a lot of those lighter sort of Italian and Iberian varieties work well at cooler temperatures, chilled, much more versatile. So I think that's what you're going to see more of coming out of Australia, whether it's classic varieties done in a different style or it's completely new varieties for Australia, which are more attuned to both the climate and the way that people actually eat and drink in Australia.
And we're back. So, as I said, a vineyard, a bird, and a power line.
And an amazing wine at the end of it.
And an amazing wine. And I think that's, what's important. Stories are great because it makes wine memorable, but what's in the bottle has to be great. And, there's a huge range of Grenache from Thistledown. And what's great, I got introduced to these wines not very long ago, maybe 4 or 5 months back. I went to a trade tasting in London and got to drink, 6 different Grenaches side by side with Giles in London. And it's one of those wineries that each place is an absolutely different wine, but you can tell it's got the same winemaking behind it, if that makes sense. There's a style behind, but it's not, it's not, oh, we're making 6 different wines so we can sell 6 different wines. Each wine has its own thing, its own story, its own style, and this one just, it's not the cheapest one, it's not the most expensive one, it kind of sits in the middle, but this just kind of spoke to me of like, this is cool, this is different, this is fun, and it's got an animal on the label, and that is the way of choosing a really good Australian wine, is if it's got an animal on the label, it's got to be good. That's correct, isn't it?
Yellowtail are about to.
I'm not sure I'm paying you anymore, Jamie.
No, I'm out. It's all done. But this is a good animal on the label. So
it's an electrocuted eagle or something. So there's some very cool comments in the chat. Obviously, we've been for those of you who aren't in the chat, we've been having a very good discussion. We first of all, we had a question about what does dry grown mean. Both of the interviewers have said dry grown. Now, obviously. Emma said this in the chat. It's whether they irrigate or not, whether they water the vines or not, and there's different types of irrigation that you can use. Like, so if you go down to Riverina to make those sweet wines, they do flood irrigation. They flood the whole vineyards out, and that's what then the water evaporates to create the mist that then enables the botrytis to grow. But that's just trying to do something quite specific. Then you can do sort of big things that spray around. Or you can do drip irrigation, which just drips down onto the vine itself. The other little conversation we had was, and perhaps Emma can just talk about this, was that she's made the point that Australia has some of the oldest vines in the world of that particular variety of grape. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things a lot of people don't know about Australia. Do you think of Australia as a new world country, so therefore it doesn't have very old vines? But actually it's totally the reverse. It in fact has many, many old vineyards, far older than exist in Europe. So I put in the chat, for example, the oldest Shiraz is in Australia, and that was planted in 1843. That's in the Barossa Valley, and it goes into Langmile's Freedom Shiraz, which you can buy over here. It's about 50 quid a bottle or something. And just think of that history you're drinking when you're trying that. I just think it's incredible. And this is just because most of Australia, and now we're really getting into wine geek territory, most of Australia is phylloxera free. So you've probably heard of phylloxera, or may have heard of phylloxera. It's something, it's a louse that exists in the soil. It came from America across to Europe in the late 1800s and essentially decimated the vineyards. Yeah, thanks, Americans. Essentially decimated the vineyards in Europe. And what had to happen over time, people realized they had to pull up all of the vineyards and then replant them on grafted rootstock, because Native American vines were resistant to phylloxera. They had to basically put the two vines together, have the American rootstock in the ground so it doesn't get affected by the phylloxera and the Vitis vinifera on top. Australia, most of it, so all of South Australia, for example, is phylloxera free. So they can still be planted on their own roots, and that is why they have these incredible old vineyards there.
That's amazing. And it is mad to think, obviously the world's Syrah, or the Syrah and Shiraz are the same. Syrah was growing in the Rhone Valley in Hermitage for many years before it was brought over to Australia. But it's not that vine. That vine died. It was an absolute decimation. Vineyards were just completely wiped out, because here is a bug that loves eating vines, and here is vines as far as the eye can see. It's like Jamie in an all-you-can-eat buffet in Vegas.
Wow, I have just been compared to phylloxera. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, you're American, so he's an American citizen.
I'm American louse destroying happiness.
Absolutely.
I'm glad.
Absolutely. That's a fascinating wine fact. Cool wine. For me, I haven't read the notes of this one, I'm afraid, beforehand, because I've been absolutely flat out, and I got hit in the nose by a massive waft of the sort of banana and kirsch that screams out to me, this is a significant part of it is whole bunch, and they've just thrown the bunches of grapes in, then they crush and destem a little bit of it on top. So part of it's been fermented by your classic yeasts, and part of it is being fermented, at least in the early stages, by an enzymatic process, which is something that happens inside the grape. The yeast want to get in, but there's a thick-skinned grape there that's not going to let them, but it's still kind of evolving and making a bit of alcohol, and only after that's happened does it burst open, and that does give you a really characteristic flavour, and perhaps not one that I'd normally associate with a classic sort of Spanish garnacha or something, but very cool wine.
Delicious
Very
wine.
interesting.
Delicious wine. Lots of fun. So, where are we at? That was, if I can count right, that's wine 4. So
Cherry,
after
dominant
wine,
thing. So there you go. That's where your kirsch comes from.
Yeah.
The cherry and the kirsch.
yeah, cherry, nutmeg, a little bit of smokiness, some spice there. Yeah, black
Velvet
cherries,
tannins.
velvet tannins. And I think that's kind of a running theme with some of these wines, that the tannins are so well integrated. It's so smooth. It's so round. It's so delicious.
How do they do that? I mean, is it by? I sort of know some of the theory. Is it by careful extraction, by not pushing the skins too hard to get the tannins out of them, or is it by a more sort of oxygen-rich environment that allows some of those tannins to bind to the wood in the barrels? I genuinely don't know.
I think in this wine, certainly this has very, very careful handling because they want to have this more kind of light, ethereal style of Grenache.
Yeah.
But I think in general in Australia, a lot of it is actually down to the sunlight. So Australia is relatively close to the equator, and therefore you have this sunlight intensity, even in the cooler climate regions. So therefore the tannins are quite evolved and much, much softer than you would expect from Europe, which is that much more northerly.
Very interesting.
There you go.
Thank you. I like that. I like that a lot.
Fantastic.
Two cool wines.
2 very cool wines. We should drink another cool wine then.
We should, because it is now 9 o'clock. So we're about ready for 5 and 6. Now, this one is from a man called Bob, who is one of Jamie's best mates. And when we interviewed him a while ago, he proceeded to, Jamie and he proceeded to drink through about 2 bottles at, what was about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Not my time. I was sensible.
No, you were sensible, but 6 o'clock a.m. and he was about to go off and do a day of harvest. He was bringing the grapes in, so all I can hope is that somebody else was driving the bloody tractor. That's all I can say.
I tell you, like Burt Vineyards, and if you've been with us for a while on these tastings, we've done a couple of wines from Burton Vineyards, and they do everything from a fantastic 6-quid bottle of Shiraz that you can buy in co-op, all the way up to these single vineyard projects and everything in between. But he does a lot of different things, like the weird and wonderfuls, So we've got the De Rif here. He does Fiano. He does Vermentino. He does a wine called Aranal, which I'd never heard of the grape itself.
Aranu.
No.
For people who watched Shooting Stars in the 1990s, that might mean something.
Yeah, you're aging yourself. You're officially an old vine.
Absolutely.
But so there's this grape that he makes, Aranal, that I'd never heard of until I tasted it at an Australian tasting a couple of years back, and I think there's like 10 hectares in the world, and he's got 8 of them. It's kind of cool. So this is De Rif. It's big, it's rich, it's jammy, it's fruity, and it's a really well made wine. But we talk about a lot of places we try and find these pockets of hillside slopes and large diurnal shifts and things like that. Riverina doesn't really do that. It's kind of warm, it's kind of flat, it's kind of fertile, you get good yields, but what this means is you can make
dry, yeah? You used to have plentiful supply,
but you can make a solid, fruity, drinkable, delicious wine for not huge amounts of money, because you don't have to hand harvest, and there's always that little bit of give and take as to where you can mechanise and save some money and where you hand harvest for that.
I have a feeling it might have been where the world record for mechanical harvesting was set, but I could be wrong on that one. That's a geeky fact.
That would be a geeky fact.
These tractors are immensely impressive. They just churn through the vineyards like row by row by row, and they take the grapes off the vine in a very quick, gentle movement. It shakes the vine from side to side with these plastic fingers. The grapes are just caught in these little buckets which get rotated up to the top. Then they're taken off the stems and they're sorted. So all the leaves, anything that you don't want there, is blown away or drops down through these little rollers. And it's an amazing process to watch. And with the latest, greatest machines, it can be just as not just as gentle as hand harvesting. There was a Twitter storm about whether mechanical harvesting or hand harvesting was better the other day, as is classic wine Twitter. But they are amazing to watch in action, and I think it was just, you know, the rate they collect grapes in is amazing, and that's an advantage in Australia because of what Emma was saying earlier. This diurnal shift, the coolness of the night, means that at night is when you want to be harvesting, because those grapes don't start to heat up and overheat and start fermenting inside the tractors. The harvesters and the traders. So it's a good match for Australia's climate, machine harvesting.
Absolutely. So we're going to let everyone have a little sip and a drink on this. But
it's like a little Syrah, this.
Your inside jokes. We'll come back to that. But I was thinking, you know, we've been talking about alternative varietals today, and you know, alternative is sometimes because people want to do something a little bit different. Some people want to be cutting edge. Some people want to be pioneering. But sometimes we've got to start doing different things in the wine industry because it is getting warmer and things are changing and all that kind of stuff. So Alex, he didn't get to go and hang out with Greta, but he did make a little video about what's happening with climate change and how it could affect wine and packaging, and maybe the little bits that we could do. So
yeah, and I think I mentioned it briefly in the intro video that Aussie winemakers are finding that they are now harvesting up to 6 weeks earlier than they used to. There was a really complicated graph that went up, but basically it was just showing how it started, and it was just suddenly dropping off, and it's a massive change. You know, 6 weeks, a month and a half. What's that going to be if it keeps going that way? So, but this is a problem the whole world is facing. The fact is, Australia are absolutely on the front line of this, and combined with the fact they love experimentation and research, these are the guys who are doing the most to try to understand what you can do, and to create solutions for it so that we can keep enjoying these great wines. So let's watch a little video, and I hope it's interesting.
Earlier, I mentioned that there are some things you can do in the vineyards to help defend grapes against ever-increasing temperatures and drought as the world continues to warm. But wait, you say, is climate change actually real? Well, let's have a look at a bit of evidence from the world of wine. If you look at the Loire Valley, today there is a third more sugar in the grapes than there was in 1981, and about a third less acidity. If all else stays the same, that would mean that there's a third more alcohol in the wine as well. If this continues, which all the current models say it will, you can write off large parts of the current wine world. In fact, on the world's current path, it's hard to see how all the oil that is today in the ground won't at some point end up in the atmosphere. The IPCC modelled this high emissions outcome, and let's put it into wine terms. Essex becomes Bordeaux. Bordeaux becomes the very south of Spain. So what on earth can you do? Well, as we're showing today, choosing tougher grape varieties that are better at coping with the heat and drought is the best start. And of course, choosing to grow them in the cooler, shadier, higher places definitely helps too. The grape variety alone makes up to a 25-day difference in ripening date. Even changing just the clone can make up to 8 days of difference. But unfortunately, that is not what you're growing, and you can't very easily move your vines. So without digging it up and trying again, there are still a few tricks that growers use. First of all, of course, you can pick earlier, which helps keep the acidity higher and the sugar lower, but the flavours just won't develop. So we have to look at slowing down the rate we make that sugar. Now, if you look at the vines grown in lush, cool areas, you'll likely see long hedges of grapes with vines held up by trellising. But if you head to the plains of Spain or South Africa, you'll find these funny little bushes. So why the difference? Each leaf of a plant can be thought of as a mini solar panel. Except instead of electricity, it's producing sweet, sweet sugar. The more light and heat, the more sugar, and that gets transported into the grape. In cooler places, you therefore need more leaves to get it ripe. Hence, you need a trellis to hold all of that canopy up and catch the light. But as you get hotter, fewer and fewer leaves are needed, so no need for the trellis. Hence, just a little bush. Now, trimming your bush, don't snigger at the back, can make up to 12 days back of ripening time, but it can stress out the vine, and if it turns into a cooler year, you can't put the leaves back. One of the most powerful things you can do is very easy, and way back in winter, you can delay pruning the last year's growth away. Now, as the vine starts to wake up in the spring, it puts its efforts into trying to bring all of the buds out of dormancy and growing new leaves and grapes. But when we prune, you reduce the number of buds that it has to get ready, probably by a factor of 10 or so they all take a lot longer. If you wait until the very last minute to prune, it can delay it up to 5 days. You can also grow the trunk longer. That helps with another 5 days. Or in really extreme years, it's time to put sunscreen on your sensitive areas. That's right, people have created natural sunscreens made of clay usually, that either block the ultraviolet light or prevent the leaves from breathing in the carbon dioxide, which all slows down photosynthesis, the old process that makes that sugar. Now, it might sound pretty crazy trying to put sunscreen on each of hundreds of thousands of plants, but it's just one of the things that grape growers have to do to hold back the tide. And luckily, they don't have to do it by hand, you can spray it on. Now, for coping with drought, you can choose specific rootstocks which can squeeze every last drip of water you can out the soil, and you can space the vines out a bit more so they don't compete with each other. But eventually, there's not much of an alternative to irrigation. Or, we could do the only two things which will reduce this change. Firstly, we probably ought to leave most of that fossil fuel left in the ground. And finally, we should invest in taking the carbon out of the air by planting a lot more, or high-tech methods. Wine, of course, is not the worst culprit in the world of carbon emissions, but the easiest way that our industry can help is by moving to lighter packaging like our bag-and-box solution or paper bottles. Nearly half of the carbon footprint of a bottle of wine is the glass, and yes, of course you can recycle it, but firstly, a lot of it tends to end up in landfill, and secondly, to recycle it you have to heat it to incredible temperatures, in fact 1500 degrees C. Recycling just a 1.5 kilo glass bottle, as you quite often see in very high-end wines, will produce around 2 whole kilograms of carbon dioxide. 2 kilos? That's more than the bottle weighs. The aluminium in our pouches, well, for starters there's only 2 grams of it per pouch, but the melting point is so much lower, so recycling it uses much less energy. But anyway, if you want your favourite wine to stay even something close to what it is today, of course we can all do our bit, and winemakers can do a certain amount in the vineyard or even the region. But Australia is absolutely at the forefront of this research. Think of them as the front line in this battle against climate change. So winemakers from all around the world should be looking very closely at this new generation of Australian wines like these we're showing tonight to see what we can all learn about the very future of wine itself.
So here, less tasting notes than we've seen for the previous wines, but I think it is because it kind of does exactly what you expect it to do. It's jammy, it's rich, it's juicy, it's beautiful, it's fun.
Before I met you, I wouldn't have known what to expect a Durif to do or a Petit Syrah. I mean, I think the name of Petit Syrah would have probably given me a bit more of a clue. And yeah, if you think about this compared to a Shiraz or a Syrah, it isn't quite as big and bold. It's got a little bit of the edge taken away from it.
This for me is a red wine. You know when you get people going, I don't drink red wine. This is a red wine for people who don't drink red wine, because it's got fine grained tannins, as the tasting notes say. It's soft, it's smooth, it's drinkable. And this is a wine for me that, it's an event wine that you put it in the middle of the table and everybody's happy with it. Everyone's going to have a glass of that, and it's drinkable and it's delicious and it's a lot of fun. And
loads of chocolate. Someone has also said in the chat. It's. I think this is the fascinating thing about Bob. Is he the guy who bought Penfold's old winery?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, you might have covered that, but
I didn't. But he did.
No, we've done it the previous time. And Penfold's, well, not only making probably some of the best well-known wines in Australia, but also make a whole range from all elements of the price spectrum. So that was a big winery that he just sort of got only a few years really after starting up, and I think the opportunity came and he goes, all right, I'll do it. So, but he has the time to make these little pet projects, and I think that's a marvellous thing. The capitalists in everyone will say, focus on what will sell and what will make you the most money. This probably won't make him much money at all, but he wants to. So if I want to drink a wine, I want to drink a wine that the winemaker wants to make, not that he has to make.
Is that your top tip?
That's my
top tip. But yeah, delicious wines. Have you got any thoughts on this one, Emma?
I mean, I think you put the nail on the head when you said it's fun. To me, before I tried this, in my head, Jura tends to be quite raisined and quite sort of almost a bit port-like. This to me is not like that at all. This is almost like cherry cola. It's just fun and fruity, and as you say, it's a sort of wine everyone would enjoy. I was really impressed by it.
Yeah, it's drink it with your friends, and it sits that thing that, you know, if you've got some friends who are a bit wine geeky, you can pull that out because they've probably not seen something like that. And if your friends aren't wine geeky, it's very easy and delicious to drink. So it wins for everybody.
It's massively sharp and tannic and
exactly. So should we do wine number 6? I think that's a good idea.
I think we should. But before we do one, well, I tell you what. While everyone pause wine number 6, I've got a question because Emma, for me, when climates start getting hotter, winemakers seek to try to preserve the acidity in the wine. And because I haven't gone over to Australia or to any hot climates since I really started this journey, partly because of this bloody disease that's going around the world at the moment.
Phylloxera.
Yeah, phylloxera, exactly. No, Jamie.
I'm definitely not going around the world.
No, indeed. None of us are going around the world. But one of the things that slightly sort of, if you have your purity head on, we love to think that the grape goes into the bottle with practically no intervention whatsoever. And I don't see how you could be making wine in this sort of environment without having to sort of add back in some of the acidity that will get lost. Is there much kind of acidification that goes on, but people putting the tartaric acid back in?
Yeah, I mean, I actually haven't visited Riverina, so I can't say specifically, but certainly acidification will happen in various parts of Australia, as it does in pretty much any hot country, Spain, California, wherever, definitely. But it's very much dependent on the region. As I said, for example, Clare Valley, hot in the day, very cold at night. So you have amazing natural acidity. There is absolutely no need to add extra acid. But yeah, so it really depends on the region. But I think the winemakers in Australia as a whole just want to create the best wine possible that they can get. And if that means adding a little bit of extra acidity to give that lift and freshness, then they will, absolutely.
No, if you taste your meal that you're creating and it doesn't have enough bite to it, you'll put a bit of pepper into it. If it doesn't have enough salt into it, you'll put a bit of salt into it. And that is a less spoken about part of the winemaking process, but it's an important part. It's a dirty word, winemaking, but actually we are creating something that we want to drink. So why shouldn't we put in? And adding acid, it's not like we're pouring battery acid in. This is a natural acid that is exactly the same one that is found in the wine, just in normal situations. So there's nothing harmful about it. It's just it can trigger the sort of the puritanical thinking winemaker or consumer or whatever it is that we're talking about. But yeah, I think for a place like Riverina, that's probably where you're more likely to have to do something like that. But it doesn't matter. As long as the end result is good, why do we care?
Exactly that.
It does come down to drinking what's good in the bottle, and and I think this is prime example of where we can do with doing stuff that's good in the bottle. So we're doing a Touriga Nacional Tempranillo blend, so a bit of Iberian.
Last tasting note for 1.5, Nutella. I'm gonna have to try that.
Dive back in. Yeah. So this is Steve Pannell, phenomenal winemaker. He used to be at Hardy's, then went out on his own. He won Winemaker of the Year from Gourmet magazine in 2015. So he's had some accolades. But this is, we've got Tempranillo that we all know from Rioja, and then we've got Touriga Nacional that we may or may not know, but we find that in port and in Portugal. So we've got a little bit of an Iberian feel here, but two different.
But not a cross of grapes.
not a cross of grapes. A blend of grapes.
I felt like I had a teacher marking my script, and she put I said rather carelessly that it was a cross of Spanish Tempranillo and Portuguese Touriga, and it is not a cross of these two grapes, because that would be if a mummy grape came along and a daddy grape came along. They loved each other very much. They'd create a cross grape called Tempranillo Touriga. It's not that. It's just some Tempranillo wine, some Touriga wine blended to make
Tempranillo Nacional.
Tempranillo Nacional.
We'll blend that one. That will be next thing. But what's cool about this is It's two different grapes from two different sites. And, so it's not we've got a row of Tempranillo here and a row of Touriga here, with two different sites. So we're looking at what is growing well in the right place. We've not just bunged a bit of, new stuff in the ground and see what happens. And it comes in, it's mainly, I say mainly Tempranillo. It's 57 Tempranillo, 43 Touriga Nacional.
Very earthy on the nose, isn't it?
The Tempranillo comes from a slightly cooler place than the Touriga comes from. And the Touriga, if you've ever, you've had a port, that's what gives it the bigness, the richness, the fruitiness, the jamminess. And then the Tempranillo, similar to Rioja, gives it that kind of acidity that kind of balances it out. So you don't end up with this kind of overly sticky because if you had loads of Touriga in warm climate, you're just going to get this warm, sticky kind of big fruit bowl thing.
I want to go and get some charcuterie.
No, this is definitely charcuterie. So this is 2018 vintage. So it's not young, but it's not old. So there's a little bit of age on it. So you're starting to see some of these developmental characteristics come through in it, so you get that little bit of.
So she's stolen the rest of it.
Well, I'd say fair. I don't know if I meant to say fair play or rude. It's one of the two. But for this one, I'll hand back over to you, Emma, and any insight you have on Steve, his wines, and your thoughts on these Iberian grapes are hanging out in Australia, close to Adelaide.
Yeah, I mean, I think Touriga actually for me is something that's really worth keeping an eye on, particularly in McLaren Vale and surrounds, because I think it's making some really beautiful wines, and you tend to always get this kind of lifted floral note with it as well. I don't know if you're picking it up on this wine. I am, which just kind of gives it a lift and a sort of vibrancy, which I really like. But yeah, certainly Tempranillo as well seems to be finding quite a happy home, and again getting that kind of strawberry red fruit that you get in Rioja, but seeing it with a, I suppose, slightly Australian bent coming out of McLaren Vale. But yeah, Steve is an incredible winemaker. He makes all sorts of different wines, obviously, the traditional Shiraz and Grenache as well, but then experimenting with these more alternative varieties too. So certainly a winemaker to hunt out.
No, and you look at these things that are coming through the tasting, exactly what we talked about. There's chocolate, there's great words in there like complex and warming like a port.
Yeah, well,
which is, it's got that variety. And where are we at? Alcohol on this 14.
14.
So
14.
it's not the highest we've had so far.
No.
So
but it has that warming characteristic we associate with port. I think when you taste a wine that has a flavour profile that's very similar to something else, so you associate it. Like when we associate a fruity wine with a sweet wine, and we've talked about that a million times, but it's not necessarily got any sugar in it anymore. It's just your brain connects these things. And so port, we all know, and we have a port every now and then, normally around Christmas. We don't drink enough port. The port grapes transported into a drier style of wine do really work. For a while you can be just sort of tricked, and you're thinking you're expecting the sweetness to come and coat you and give you that sort of hug afterwards, but it's still there. And I think I don't know, I just would love to have some really good, rich and a little bit fatty Portuguese food with this. I think that's for me where it sits. That sort of north of Portugal, north of Spain, lots of sort of pork, or alternatives if you're a non-meat eater. But yeah, it's great. It's
but that was other food types are available. That was really good.
Pork.
So do we want to see if we can get these polls up so people can start voting for their favourite wine? So
yeah, I'm just going to quickly check the chat.
We're going to check.
There's some cool. Wine 6 is like those cherry liqueur chocolates you get at Christmas, but drier. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. I think you've done it in about 20% of the words that I use. So well.
Fantastic. So you can come and host next time, and we can get it done in 30 minutes.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Kathy says, if you like white port, try Peter van Giemt. I don't know that winemaker, but yeah, sounds good to me. I certainly there's one standout wine in the pricing that I think is cracking value for money.
But absolutely. So as we go through this poll, we're getting to that time of night, and I could ask you to do this, Emma, and we could spend another 6 hours doing it. But do you want to kind of
Tempranillo is the same as Tintoriz.
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Why have I not known?
And Tinta de País, and Sensibel, and Uva de Liebre, and every other of the 4,000 synonyms that Tempranillo has.
Yeah, Tempranillo does have too many synonyms. I think
it does
one
indeed.
thing on which we can all agree.
But I think we've tasted some really cool wines tonight. We've had a nice little tour of some things that are happening. But anything, not that we've missed, but any other standouts, and just kind of sum up where you think Australia is going to be going in the next couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, and what we should be keeping an eye on as new things happen, apart from everywhere and everything, because it's all wonderful.
Yeah, apart from that, I think everything we've tasted here is a great kind of snapshot. There's so many other exciting grape varieties. I've had some really exciting Mencia, so that grape variety from kind of northwest Spain. Really exciting stuff coming out of McLaren Vale. All the rest of the Italian grape varieties. Nebbiolo, for example. I've had some amazing Nebbiolo from Australia. And that is one of those grape varieties everyone's like, nah, you can't make it anywhere apart from Piedmont. You can, actually. Some incredible stuff happening down in the Yarra Valley. And the other interesting one is Prosecco, because Prosecco as a grape variety is planted in Australia and is labelled as Prosecco. Obviously can't be if it's sent over here. But there's some really, really amazing Prosecco made in Australia too, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of.
For those of you who don't know the story on this one, Italy was a little bit naughty, weren't they? I think that's my take
Exactly
on it.
that.
And my take. So you can't protect a name of a grape, and the grape used to be called Prosecco. So the wines that came from northern Italy that were made from the Prosecco grape, that was Prosecco. But Australia started making it, and they started doing it really well. Really, really well. And the Italians went, this is not something that I like. And so the only thing that you can protect is the name of a region. And so they changed the grape and they said, what can we call it that sounds as unappealing as possible?
And we went with Glera.
Glera.
Who doesn't love a bit of Glera in the evening?
Could I have a bottle of Glera, please? I'd really like bottomless Glera breakfast brunch thing. No, nobody wants that. People want Prosecco. So they found a village that was called Prosecco, and it made this shape of a wine region, which kind of went down to the little village of Prosecco and then went up to the actual vineyards where the grapes are grown, and they called this the Prosecco DOC, and they said you can't call it Prosecco anymore, and the Aussies rightly said screw you, but unfortunately the rules came in, and so if you can, I don't know how much of it is in the UK. I don't know what it's called at all, but if you get over to Australia, do try their Prosecco. It's not from Italy. It's delicious.
Fantastic.
There you go, a bit of history as well.
So any other final thoughts so we can sum up, Emma?
Oh gosh, final thoughts. I think, to me, having tasted through all those wines now, what this just shows me is how much diversity there is in Australia, and how much excitement as well. And all of these wines you could have with such different meals, different occasions. There's kind of something for everyone there, which is why one of the reasons I just love Australia. You can always find something new and exciting.
The vote for wine one annoyingly doesn't give us an average. But I can tell you that the vast majority of them are in the very top part for
4s, 5s.
It's most people found the Semillon about a sort of 4-star. I'd say it's probably about the same for the Asiatico. Sangiovese, there's nobody dislikes the Sangiovese. It's a very likeable wine. Grenache seems to have split people a little bit, but again, nobody hates it. It's a really cracking wine. Lots of 5 stars, lots of 4 stars. But jury 50% on 4-star for the £12.95 bottle of wine from
That's
a man
fantastic.
called Bob. I like that. And the Tempranillo, everyone loves this.
Tempranillo scores well.
Yeah,
Tempranillo scores very well. So
it's autocorrected to touring.
touring.
Sorry about that. It wasn't a touring wine. The wine of the night. It's the Touriga, and in the second place the Asiatico. So that's fantastic, and everyone's had a great time.
And as we say, the wines, if you love them, they're all available on the website. So get in and buy them, because the only way we start to see more of these wines get over to the UK is them getting the support. If it comes over and it doesn't sell, it's, you know, either it's not going to come anymore, or it's going to be 6 bottles of it and the price is going to jump up. So let's start trying to support these. And
it's been a tough couple of years for Australia. Who doesn't remember the fires of a few years ago? Yes, I know lots happened between then, but all of the, you know, the terrible bushfires. Someone mentioned it earlier about about the wildlife that was decimated, the vineyards that were destroyed. That was awful, and of course, not just COVID's come along and there are no tourists, and the Aussie wine industry does like its tourism. People have not been free to move around. They've not been able to go between different states. But I think probably the biggest challenge that the Australian wine industry has had in the last couple of years is China, because China was I'm about to say things I'm not 100% correct. You're
going to put a stat up when there's someone from Wine Australia on the call to call you out on this, Alex.
Lots of Aussie wine, didn't it?
It was the biggest by value, the biggest export market by value. Yeah. The UK is the number 1 by volume, has been for a long time. We love Aussie wine here, which is great. But the Chinese used to not drink as much as us, but drink very, very expensive Aussie wine.
Yeah, they loved their bottles of Henschke, Hill of Grace and Penfolds Grange.
So I think I'm going to take this one. Just a massive thank you to Emma. Thank you so much for coming on and dealing with us. And it's been an absolute pleasure. We've got Christmas tasting next month, so we look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah.
And then we will be diving into the new year. We're going to be doing some wine trends. And
I have no idea what we're doing next year. It's been a bit of a crazy.
We're doing dry January.
Oh yeah.
Dry whites, dry reds. The world's going to be a good place.
Excellent.
But on that note, Emma, once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone who's supported us and joined the tasting. Yeah. And we'll see you all very, very soon.
We will indeed.
So is it time?
Take care. And I think Emma, have you got your score there to sing along? Oh,
I don't.
No.
Sorry, you didn't send it over.
Tragedy. I didn't get it over in time. We're going to have to leave it to some idiot. And a man who does not have a clue what a grapevine looks like, or possibly we couldn't find one within 5 minutes of our little wine.
Exactly.
So there we go. Anyway, good night all. Have a wonderful evening and look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.
Once a jolly vintner camped by some aged vines, after a morning of pruning a field, and he sang as he rested his weary slips upon his chest. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me, pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me, and he sang as he rested his weary snips upon his chest. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. Down came the owner to check out his vineyard. The vintner showed him where his careful cuts would be. He asked the owner for some help. 10,000 vines were still to go. Will you come a pruning the Syrah with me? Pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah. Will you come pruning the Syrah with me? And he sang as he protested, 10,000 vines still left to go. Will you come pruning the Syrah with me? But the owner said he couldn't. To the farm he must return, and as he left, out fell a bottle of Grange so sweet. The vintner picked it up and smiled. Oh yes, you're mine, he popped the cork. You can come a pruning the Syrah with me. Pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. And he sang as he snipped and sipped that famous wine. It tasted fine. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. Back at the farmhouse, the owner found his Grange was gone. He glanced out the window, a drunk vintner he could see. Stop, he said, the vintner ran, half-empty bottle of Penfolds in hand. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. Pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. And he sang as he sprinted and glugged the Penfolds as he ran. Oh, come a pruning the Syrah with me. Up jumped the owner and took his bloodhounds off their leash, setting them after the vintner who ran free. "You'll never take me alive," the vintner shouted as they bit. "Who'll come a-pruning the Syrah with me?" Pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah, who'll come a-pruning the Syrah with me? And he sang as the dogs attacked as he finished off his pricey drink. "Who'll come a-pruning the Syrah with me?" "Ah, get off me, you grimy drongo! Screw!" Now if you pass those aged vines around the autumn time of year, a voice can be heard, a singing eerily. Its ghostly presence still rings out and asks you if you'll kindly help. Come a-pruning the Syrah with me. Pruning the Syrah, pruning the Syrah, who'll come a-pruning the Syrah with me? And his ghost may be heard as you pass by those aged vines. Who'll come a-pruning the Syrah with me?